Dust curled behind the stagecoach like slow smoke from a tired fire. It sighed to a halt before the little mercantile in Willow Creek, and a woman in a black traveling dress stepped down with care. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, 43, city hands, steady eyes, the kind who had buried a man, sold the silver, and come west because there was nowhere else to go. The town was one street and a long breadth, weathered fronts, a saloon with a cracked piano, a boarding house that leaned as if listening to gossip. The mountains watched from far off, their tops already white. October's sun still had warmth in it, but winter was standing just outside the door. Margaret held a small notice folded neat in her glove. She had read it until the paper turned soft. Cook wanted. Room and board. Inquire at Morrison's store or Circle M Ranch. It wasn't poetry, but it sounded like shelter. A bell rang when she pushed inside. Barrels, sacks, tin coffee. A thin man with spectacles looked up from a ledger. "Help you, ma'am?" "I'm here about the position at the Circle M, the cook." He glanced over her dress, her shoes, the clean knots at her wrist. Then he frowned the way men do when they're trying to be kind and honest at the same time. "Hard country, 20 miles, mostly men. Stove's a beast." "I can learn," she said, calm as a church pew. "Jake Caldwell runs that outfit. Fair, but he don't teach." "Then I'll show him he doesn't need to." Something in her voice made him close the ledger. "Wagon goes at dawn. I'll tell Pete to make room." She bought what little she could, a calico dress, sturdy boots, a wide-brim hat, and followed his directions to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson gave her a narrow bed, thin blankets, and 3 opinions about Jake Caldwell before the tea even cooled. Handsome, quiet, winter hard, never hit a man who didn't deserve it. Margaret lay awake anyway, listening to coyote song and piano laughter, and her own heart beating the time to a life that had ended, and one she was trying to begin. Morning put her on a supply wagon beside old Pete. The prairie unrolled in gold. Cottonwoods marked dry creeks. Cloud shadows drifted like cattle. When Pete pointed at a brand burned into a gate beam, he said, "Circle M." Then he clucked to the team, and they rattled through. The ranch sat in a bowl of land, snugged by low hills, a log house, a big barn, corrals tight with restless horses, a bunkhouse, straight and plain, everything stout, nothing pretty. Margaret saw no curtains, no flowers, no sign a woman's hand had passed through lately. "Wait here," Pete said, jumping down. He vanished inside the house and came back with a man walking behind him. Jake Caldwell wasn't old, late 30s maybe. He had a long rider's frame, easy as a fence line, and a face the weather had written on. Gray eyes, hair grown a shade too long, touched with early silver at the temples, shirt sleeves rolled, vest unbuttoned, boots that had done miles. He stopped on the packed earth and studied her like a man deciding if a horse would hold a day's work. "You ever cooked for 15 hungry hands?" His voice had Texas in it, slow even, not unkind. "No, sir, but I can learn fast and work steady. This isn't a schoolhouse. Breakfast by 5, dinner at dark, bread rising in between, wood stove that has moods, water from the well. Chickens don't pluck themselves." "Necessity is a fine teacher," she said, lifting her chin. "I've been studying hard." One corner of his mouth moved. It might have been a ghost of a smile. "You'll get a week. If you can't carry it, Pete'll take you back when he hauls the next load." "I won't need the ride," she said, though her knees felt hollow. He turned, then paused with his hand on the door latch. "One more thing." Those gray eyes softened. "Not much. This life can grind a spirit down. Last cook looked like every meal was a funeral. Didn't do the man any good. You got room in you for a little light? Can you season the work with laughter?" It startled her, not the question of labor, the question of heart. She thought of nights in Philadelphia when polite ladies ate overdone roast and still smiled because the hostess would not let the room fall heavy. "I can try," she said, "and what that'll do." He answered and swung the door. The kitchen was big and bare, the iron stove squatting like an old bull. Shelves, a long scarred table, a pantry with the basics, a small room just off the kitchen with a narrow bed. Hers. Jake explained the routine without fuss, pointed at the dampers, tapped the side of the oven. "Runs hot on the right," he said. "Coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe." Then he checked his watch. 4 hours to supper. He left her there with a matchbox, a bin that was nearly out of wood, and the quiet. She tied on an apron, rolled her sleeves, and started a fire that did not care for her one bit. The stew pot was heavy as a stone well. She filled it a ladle at a time, chopped onions until her city hands bit, kept the flame too low, then too high, then too low again. She burned the biscuits on the bottoms and undersalted the stew and boiled the coffee into a weapon. When the bell rang at last and Boots filled the room, she set it down anyway. Men ate with the blunt relief of the tired. No complaints, no praise. Jake came in last and sat the head, watchful, quiet. He ate slower than the rest, the way a man listens to a saddle for a squeak. After the dishes stacked high, he asked for a word. They stepped onto the back porch. The prairie had gone the color of a red hawk's back. Wind moved the grass like water. "The food needs more salt." Biscuits were heavy. "Coffee could take paint," he said, straight as a fence post. Then his mouth tipped that quiet inch again. "You didn't quit when the stove fought you. You asked for help. You'll get your week." He started to go, then turned back. "You read and write?" "I do." "We'll put you on the account books, too, if you got the hours. Extra pay. But remember what I said." He nodded toward the kitchen. A good meal fills a man up. A cheerful kitchen keeps him standing when the wind blows. She watched him cross the yard. Long shadow, steady stride. The sky was all copper and blue. Somewhere a horse nickered. In the doorway, she paused, hand on the wooden jamb, and breathed in smoke and stew and something like the first thread of hope. Behind her, the stove cracked its knuckles and dared her to try again. She rose in the dark to find the stars thin as frost. The kitchen felt different before dawn, like a church that hadn't been opened yet. She fed the stove slow, learned the sound the wood preferred, and set dough to waking in a blue enameled bowl. Bacon first, then potatoes sliced thin, a pan of eggs, a pot of coffee. She watched like a hawk this time. By 5, the room was warm and the smell said welcome. The men came in with sleep still on their faces. No one spoke much. Cowboys are like that, quiet until they have reason to sing. Plates filled, forks clicked. She kept the line moving and listened. There's a music to a meal when it's working. Chairs pushed back at the same time. Laughter shows up without being asked. Boots leave easy. She let that sound teach her. When it was done, the door swung and shut until only one pair of steps remained. Jake leaned on the jam, cup in hand, steam rising past his cheek. He looked at the counter, the crumb of biscuit between his fingers. "You found the stove's good side," he said. "It still gives me lip," she answered, and didn't quite smile. He held out a small book, corners softened, cover nearly smooth from palms. "Belonged to my mother," he said. "Recipes and remarks." She wrote in the margins. Some pages are more stubborn than others. Margaret took it the way a person takes a baby. 2 hands, steady. She opened to a page where a woman's tidy script marched across. Cornbread that forgives a busy morning. In the margin, add a spoon of molasses if the day looks mean. Jake's thumb rested near that note a second. Then he lowered his hand. "You sure?" she asked. "It won't do any good in a drawer," he said straight. "Men will work a little longer for bread that remembers them." She set the book on the shelf above the stove like it was a cross, where heat could not reach it. The week ran on rails. Wash, chop, stir, resto, sweep flour, scald, milk. She kept to the rhythm until it felt like the ranch itself was breathing with her. In the hours between meals, she cleaned the pantry, set labels neat, mended aprons, and began to copy the supply tallies from a wrinkled stack of receipts into a ledger with careful columns. Numbers had always calmed her. They asked for straight answers. On the 4th morning, a dust devil chased 2 young hands into the yard. They were boys, really, brimful of the wide world and not much sense. The slim one wore his hat too big. The other had a freckled nose and trouble for a smile. They were teasing a half-grown pup when the freckled one, Tom, tangled a heel on the porch step and went down hard. The sound his arm made turned heads. Someone called for Jake. Someone else fetched water. Margaret was already there. She had seen that kind of wrong angle once in a bad winter back east, when a neighbor fell on icy stairs and their doctor took 2 days to come. She gripped Tom's good shoulder and met his eyes. "Listen to me. It's broke, but we can set it," she said, calm and low. "Breathe like you're blowing out birthday candles. Quick little puffs." Jake came up fast, taking in the picture. Boy pale as paper, elbow twisted away from where God intended. His gaze cut to her. "You know what you're doing." "I do enough," she said, "but I'll need a board, a strip of cloth, and someone with strong hands who won't scare him." Jake was strong. He also didn't scare boys. He knelt on one knee, his voice somewhere between a prayer and a joke. "Tom, you're making a bigger fuss than this porch," he said. "You'll be back in the saddle before the paint dries." They worked like a team that had practiced. Board wrapped with cloth, sling torn from a clean sack. Margaret took the wrist. Steady. Jake braced the upper arm. On 3, she pulled and turned. The joint slid home with a dull, satisfying give. Tom made a sound like a kicked bell and then gulped air that tasted better. Margaret bound the arm snug, tied off the sling, and washed her hands in a pan she'd warmed on the stove. She told Tom to sleep in the bunkhouse easy and promised to send over a jar of broth later. The boy nodded, cheeks streaked, brave in the way only the young can be. The freckled friend hovered, grateful as a pup. Jake stood, rubbing his jaw, and let out a breath she hadn't seen him hold. "Where'd you learn that?" "There was a lady on our street," she said. "Midwife. She taught me a handful of things no one else had time to show me." She wiped the table as if it needed doing. "It's good to be useful." "Useful," he said, and there was something behind the word that meant more. "Thank you." The morning steadied after that. Work has a way of mending a day that starts crooked. By noon, there was beef simmering with onions, carrots soft as a memory, cornbread that rose proud, and coffee none of the men feared. She slid a small pie into the oven for later, using a trick from the margin notes, shave of lemon rind to brighten the apples, and hope the stove behaved. At dinner, conversation grew. Men talked about fences and snow lines and a steer that could open gates with its tongue. One old hand told a story about a winter so mean the creek froze to the bottom and fish slept in pockets of air. Somebody laughed big. Even Jake shook his head and let a quiet smile through. When the pie arrived, plates came back clean as white stones. After the table cleared, she set a covered bowl, a wrapped loaf, and a jar of broth on a tray. Jake reached for it. "I'll take it to Tom," he said. "I can go," she offered. He looked like he'd say no out of habit, then thought better. "Come along, then." He'd take the medicine better from the hands that fixed him. They walked past the corral, where a dun mare turned and watched them go. The bunkhouse smelled of soap and leather and the kind of sweat that comes from honest drain. Tom was awake, eyes bright now that pain had settled into a dull complaint. He drank the broth as if it were a river in July and said thank you so earnest it warmed the room. On the way back, wind moved a row of cottonwoods, and the light through the leaves made a pattern across the yard like quilt squares. Jake slowed near the porch. "There's a dance in town next Saturday, Richard," he said, looking not at her, but at the far hills. "Harvest sort of thing. Folks bring pies and try not to step on each other." "I haven't danced in years," she answered. No, me neither," he said. The corner of his mouth did its old shy business. "Some of the men like a treat now and again. If you need anything from the store, we can plan a supply run then." He could have left it there. Business plain and nothing more. But he didn't. He added, almost careful, "And if you care to try a turn, the floor's big. No one will mind if we go slow." She watched the wind and the hills and his steady hands holding nothing. Something settled inside her, the way a table sits, right when the leg is fixed. "I'll be glad to," she said. The cottonwoods clapped once, like the land approved, and somewhere the pup barked at nothing at all. That night, she turned down the lamp in her small room and touched the little cookbook's cover. In the margin beside apple pie that forgives a hard day, a new note had appeared in different handwriting. "Laughter helps the crust." She didn't know who wrote it. She only knew the line made the room feel warmer. Outside, the sky deepened to iron blue, and the coyotes started their thin hymn down along the creek. The stove ticked as it cooled, like a contented animal heading to sleep. Margaret lay still and listened, and the sound of boots on the porch drifted across the quiet. One set, pacing once, then stopping as if the person had decided something and walked away. Saturday came wearing sunlight and wind. Morning chores rolled the ranch awake. Boots on plank, gates clanking, a mare whickering to her foal. Margaret moved through the kitchen with her sleeves pushed back, calm, quick, sure. She set loaves to cool on a rack and wrapped 2 pies in clean muslin for the dance. The men teased that they'd follow the pies like hounds trail bacon grease. She only smiled and kept tying knots that would hold. Jake showed up in the doorway about mid-afternoon, hat in his hands as if he'd been thinking of words and needed something to keep them from spilling. He had shaved close. The silver at his temples showed more when his jaw was smooth. It didn't make him softer, just clearer. Wagon's hitched, he said. We'll haul feed to the north lot first, then head in. Won't keep you out late. I'm not made of sugar, she answered. I don't melt after dusk. He stood a second longer, eyes moving over the room, then landed on the small change she'd made that morning. A plain curtain she'd sewn from sackcloth, hung on a bit of twine over the far window to cut a draft that came main in the evenings. He walked to it, thumbed the cloth. You trying to civilize me? He asked, quiet. I'm trying to keep the wind where it belongs. He studied the curtain like it had applied for a job. Kitchen's a workplace. Men track mud, grease splatters. Pretty won't last. It doesn't have to last forever, she said steady. Just long enough for supper. A line formed between his brows. Not anger. Thought. He lowered the muslin and let the matter rest, though she saw it had scratched some old board in him. He reached for the pies and one of the loaves. Let's take the road. They rode with a pair of hands on the wagon seat, hay shifting soft at their backs. The prairie wore that late autumn look, grass gone pale as a faded coat, sky wide enough to make a person believe in mercy. Cottonwoods rattled their coins of light over a creek bed that needed rain. Far off, a hawk hung on air, as if the world had paused to keep it. When Willow Creek appeared, it smelled of sawdust and cinnamon and harness oil. Lanterns had been strung along the boardwalk like low stars. Music warmed up behind the schoolhouse door. Fiddle testing, a guitar, finding its tuning. A man's voice telling a joke he'd told to the same laughter for 20 years. Inside, the women had worn their best without showing it off. Men had washed behind their ears. The floor looked good for dancing and better for falling in love. Margaret set her pies down with the others, added the loaf to the basket, and stood for a heartbeat without anything to do with her hands. A neighbor woman came up, broad-cheeked, kind eyes, flour still ghosting her sleeves. You must be the new cook at Circle M. I'm Hattie Boone. I sell eggs and opinions. Margaret Sullivan, she said, shaking a hand that felt like a promise. Hattie nodded toward the door where Jake was talking to the pastor. He's stubborn, she said, fond and frank. Not cruel. Saved my boy once when a flood took our bridge. Rode straight into water up to the saddle horn. Both of them came out cussing and laughing. He asked me to bring laughter to the kitchen, Margaret said, before she could swallow it back. Hattie's face softened. Then he told you the truth he lives by. The music started in earnest. First a waltz, to ease folks into the evening like you ease a horse into cold water. Jake came through the crowd, didn't make a show of it, just offered a hand like a man puts out a chair. She placed her palm in his. They moved careful at first, counting under their breath. He was lighter on his feet than she expected, quiet as a hunter, patient as fresh dough rising. A square of lamplight climbed the wall with them as they turned. Laughter from the edges, children darting between skirts, two old men arguing about weather as if it were a person with bad manners. You dance like you let the floor do half the work, she said, smiling before she meant to. Floor's good at its job, he answered, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that made the room feel less stern. Between tunes, they stepped outside to cool their faces. Night had fallen clear and close, breath hung visible. The stars felt near enough to pluck and pocket. Street talk drifted easy. Who bought calves, who fixed a roof, who got married on a dare and stayed that way out of pride. On the far side of the schoolhouse, a small knot of men smoked and spoke names in low tones, ranchers swapping rumors about a bad run of sickness up north. A fence-line dispute, a stray cougar a day's ride from here. The world always kept a few hard cards up its sleeve. Jake leaned his shoulder to the railing, hat dangling from one finger. "Do you miss the city?" he asked. "Not the noise, not the kind that keeps a person from hearing her thoughts," she said. "I miss hot water from a pipe." She let a little smile slip. "But I like waking to broth and sunlight and men cussing a stubborn gait." He watched her, thoughtful. "You make work feel light." "It isn't light," she said. "You've just carried it alone too long." A wind moved through then, colder than the last. It brought a smell that wasn't autumn sweet, bitter, electric, the kind of scent a sky gets when it's building its own argument. Jake lifted his head like a horse in new grass. "Storm brewing over the breaks," he said. "Might blow past, might not." The next reel pulled them back inside. People danced like they were paying a debt to joy. Margaret caught sight of Tom in a corner with his sling, grinning at a girl who had ribbon in her hair and courage in her chin. He raised his good arm when he saw Margaret and shook his head, laughing as if to say he'd be fine. She nodded. That fierce, quiet pride a person feels when something they fixed stays fixed. The call for pie came like a trumpet. Plates lined up. Hattie's boy tried to cut the slices fair and got scolded for being generous. Laughter ran easy. Jake's hand brushed Margaret's as he took a tin plate. A small thing. It felt like the first warm day after a hard winter. She didn't pull away. Then a door banged open at the far end of the hall, and Pete stepped in with his hat caked white along the brim. Snow. Not a dusting. Not a flurry. The heavy kind that falls like it believes it belongs. "Wind's turned," he called. "Sky's rolling in black. We better get the team started or sleep here standing up." The music hiccuped and stopped. Men set plates down. Women wrapped babies in shawls quick as prayers. Someone said the north lock gate had a bad latch. If it went, the herd could drift into the draws, and draws became traps under ice. Jake glanced at her just once, a question and a promise in the same breath. "Go," she said, "and I'll keep the kitchen ready. Coffee on, stove hot." He tipped his hat, not as a goodbye, but as if sealing a pact. Then he was gone, out into a night that had teeth. She stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching lanterns bob toward wagons, hearing harness jingles take on a nervous clatter. Snow already whispered against the steps, fast, sure, quiet as a secret. She hugged her shawl close and tasted iron on the wind. Another gust slammed the door against its hinges hard enough to rattle the window panes. The first fat flakes blew sideways, and the town of Willow Creek pulled in its breath and held it. The ride home was a fist of wind. Snow came crosswise, thick as wool, biting any skin that dared look out. By the time Margaret reached the ranch, the yard had gone soft and white with drifts rising like quiet animals at the fence line. She pushed into the kitchen and let the door slam the weather outside. Then she made the room a harbor. Wood first, armloads, stacked close to the stove, dampers set just so, 2 kettles of water on to boil, coffee measured careful, grounds blooming like dark thunder. She salted a pot heavy and started beef and barley, onions sweating down until the sharpness turned sweet. Bread from the morning went back into the oven to wake. She dragged quilts from the closet, rolled bandages from clean flour sacks, laid out a needle, stout thread, and a bottle of whiskey she hoped wouldn't be needed, but knew likely would. Wind punched the walls and moaned in the gaps. Snow ticked at the panes. She fixed the sackcloth curtain tighter across the window, and the draft eased. When the first lantern swung into the yard, she lifted the latch and made way. Men stumbled in like shipwrecks, faces raw, mustaches iced. Jake came second, his coat rime pale, breath smoking up like prayer. 2 hands followed behind, with a third slung between them, a broad-shouldered cowpuncher named Will, blood on his shirt, eyes glassy with pain. A steer had lost its mind in the storm and found him. "Kitchen's warm," Jake said, voice steady as a beam. "We'll do it here." There's fear that clatters and fear that goes quiet. Margaret had the quiet kind. She cut Will's shirt clean, washed blood with boiled water cooled to sky warm, and found the gash under his ribs. Deep, torn by horn, mercifully high, not the belly. She thanked whatever mercy governed winter and men, then set to work. "Boil me more water," she told a hand. "Tear those sacks finer. Jake, hold 'em like you mean it." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Jake braced Will's shoulders, forearm behind the man's neck, palm steady against his chest. "Easy, Will. Listen to her," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a line thrown across deep water. She poured whiskey over the wound until the breath left the room, then stitched with small, even bites, talking low, as if speaking to a spooked mare. "You've seen worse fence wire. Breathe slow. Think of that sorrel of yours, the way her ears twitch when she hears oats." Will tried to grin and failed, which meant he heard her. Between stitches, another gust shouldered the house and rattled the world. The stove glowed harder, throwing gold up the wall. When it was done, she wrapped the ribs, propped Will in a half-sitting angle, and sent 2 men to the bunkhouse for hot bricks to tuck by his feet. She leaned close, checked the color of his lips, and looked toward Jake. "He'll mend if fever doesn't carry him," she said. "We have to keep the heat steady and watch the hours." Jake's jaw worked, the muscles along it tired as a rope. He tugged his coat off and laid it across Will's legs without thinking. Then he glanced at the window and at the sackcloth curtain she'd hung that afternoon. "Good call," he said, simple as bread. The room filled with men grateful to be alive, lined along the table, eating in the hush a storm commands. Bowls emptied. Coffee made a circle of light behind every pair of eyes. Even laughter visited, a short, rusty sound, but true. When it came, Margaret felt the kitchen settle around it like a dog around a child. She ladled seconds and kept the fire talking. Past midnight, the storm still argued its case against the house, but the howling turned to a dull, stubborn grind. Hattie's oldest boy banged through with 2 more blankets from town and word that fences were holding so far. Then he slept sitting up, mouth open, hat over his face, and looked 12 again. In the small room off the kitchen, Margaret bathed and wrung cloths, cooled Will's brow, changed bandages when they soaked through. The man drifted in and out, mumbling pasture talk. Every time he fought the pain, Jake was there, hand steady on his shoulder, voice a calm tether. "Stay with us, Will. Think about spring calves, not this foolishness," he'd say. Sometime in that long dark, Jake found her at the wash basin, sleeves wet to the elbow, hair falling out of its pins. He held a tin mug of peppermint tea that she knew wasn't in the pantry. He must have scrounged it from some forgotten box or brought it from his cabin. He set it by her hand. "You'll run yourself dry," he said. "I can stand another mile," she answered, softer than she felt. He leaned a hip against the door frame, eyes on the small room where Will sweated and turned. "When my mother was alive," he said, voice low and even, "this house was loud in the right ways. Bread cracking, girls from town laughing at my poor dancing. After she passed, I let it go quiet. Quieter than a man should allow." He tipped his chin toward the stove. "You brought the sound back." She looked at him then. Not the boss, not the man who measured work by the load, but the fellow who had learned how to listen and forgotten how to ask. The storm threw shadows over his face and made a plain truth of his eyes. "I didn't bring anything you didn't make room for," she said. He nodded, slow, the way a rider accepts a correction from a horse and pretends it was his idea all along. Near dawn, Will's fever climbed like a man scaling a bad cliff. His breath came fast, then shallow. Margaret wrung another cloth, clocked the pulse in his neck with 2 fingers, and blew across his skin to lift a little heat away. Jake knelt and spoke into Will's ear like a brother. "Don't be foolish," he murmured. "You owe me a fence mending come April." Minutes felt like hours. Steam rolled. Wind tired itself and sank down to sulk. Out in the yard, the world turned pearly, the kind of thin light that shows up before a storm gives up or shows its teeth again. Will flinched once more, then shuddered as if some grip let go. His breathing settled into a rough, decent rhythm. The fever didn't vanish, but it loosened. The room released a breath with him. Men stood and stretched like cattle when gates open. Someone laughed, quiet and wet-eyed. Margaret pressed a palm to Will's cheek and found the first honest cool she'd felt all night. She stepped onto the porch a moment to taste the new morning. Snow lay smooth and clean. The sky, worn out from fighting, had turned the color of tin. She felt the tired all through her bones, but a glad, deep kind, the kind earned. Jake followed, leaned on the post beside her, and looked out at the yard like a man considering spring. He worked a small leather pouch from his vest, thumbed it once and didn't open it yet. Not in that gray half-light. Not while the world was still deciding itself. "After the sun is up," he said, voice no louder than the wind easing through cottonwoods, "there's something I need to ask you." Sun came slow, sifting through a sky the color of pewter and warming to wheat. Snow settled into soft humps along the fence and roof lines. Smoke rose straight for the first time in a long night. Inside the kitchen, the stove purred like it had chosen kindness, not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Men woke stiff and grinning. Bowls clicked. Coffee made the place smell like courage. Margaret moved steady between kettle and table. Sleeves rolled, hair pinned back with a few stray wisps that said she'd given more than she kept. Every plate she set down felt like a quiet promise. "You are home for another day." Will slept like a child left in the sun. When he did wake, his eyes were clear and a touch embarrassed by all the attention. He tried to thank her in a long speech that wandered like a creek, and she stopped him with a palm on his shoulder. "You can pay me by mending fences when April comes," she said, and he laughed in the way a man laughs when he's been spared and knows it. Jake stood in the doorway, hat in his hand, watching the room remember itself. He didn't speak right off. A boss often talks first. Today, He let the kitchen say its piece. Clatter, low talk, one short bark of laughter that sprang from somewhere honest and rolled along the table. Then he lifted his chin at Margaret. "Step out a spell," he said. They crossed the threshold onto a porch, bright with morning. Sun struck the drifts and scattered a million small lights. It looked as if someone had thrown a saddle blanket full of diamonds over the yard. Somewhere, a mare nickered, warm breath smoking in the cold, and in the cottonwoods, a brave little bird chattered as if it had decided winter was something it could do standing up. Jake leaned against the post and took that small leather pouch from his vest. He turned it in his palm, thumb wearing the smooth spot deeper, then opened it at last. There was a ring inside, not fancy, just honest. A plain band with a tiny blue stone that flashed like creek water when sun breaks it. "My mother's," he said, "wasn't ready to carry it right after she passed. Figured I'd wait for a house that had the right sound again." He looked down toward the kitchen. "Bread cracking, work getting done, men coming in from bitter weather and finding something worth staying decent for." He met her eyes. You brought that back." She did not reach for the ring. Not yet. She looked at his face, at the years that had rubbed it smooth and stern, and at the softness he didn't hide anymore. "You brought me room," she said. "I only lit the lamps." He nodded once, as if they were trading stock and had found the price fair. Then he spoke plain. "You came for a week. I'll pay you for it twice over, but I don't want you counting days here by wages." He opened his palm. Small blue fire in the winter sun. "Stay. Not as cook, as partner. We'll keep this place right. The books, the steers, the men, and more than that. We'll keep the laughter. That was my one rule for meals." His voice eased down, rough and sure. "It's my one rule for the rest of the road." For a moment she heard things that weren't there. The clack of a Philadelphia streetcar, a doctor telling her the pain would pass, a quiet door closing when coin ran out. All those roads had ended. This porch felt like a road beginning. The land breathed slow. The house waited without hurrying her. Margaret took the pouch in both hands and lifted the ring. It was cool as creek stone. She slid it on, and it fit like it had been made from the circle her life had traveled to reach this place. "Yes," she said. "A small word can carry a long way if it's honest." It carried across the yard and through the kitchen door, because Hattie's boy, awake and full of poor discretion, whooped before he remembered manners. Laughter ran the table. Will shouted something about April work. The pup barked at the noise and then at his own bark. Jake laughed too, quiet, surprised, relieved. He didn't kiss her there on the porch, not with half the county listening and the other half pretending not to. He took her hand, turned the ring with a thumb, and pressed his forehead to hers, just long enough to tell all the stories words couldn't carry. Days put their heads down and pulled, snow crusted and softened, Will mended by inches and arguments. The men told and retold the storm tale until it grew a second horn and a taller drift. Margaret learned the stove's temper like a friend's, when to coax, when to demand, when to let the flame think it had its way. She tied the sackcloth curtain better, sewed a second for the north window. No one called it pretty. They called it right. On a Sunday, clear as a bell, they rode to town. In the mercantile, she bought a spool of blue thread and a stubborn little plant that would try its best on a sill. Jake bought nails and a notion he didn't share. then walked her past the schoolhouse where the dance had been. Light fell across the floor in long stripes. Their boots echoed. He asked for a waltz that no one would see. She set her palm to his shoulder, and they turned slow, counting breaths. The boards remembered them kindly. Spring whispered from the far hills and then spoke up. Calves bawled, fences stretched. Sleet tried one last time to talk men out of hope and failed. The kitchen stayed warm through it. The ledger stayed neat. The men ate like they meant to live. Hattie said she'd stand up and clap at a wedding if someone would tell her the date. Jake said a house needs a bit more mending before you hang new ribbons. Margaret said ribbons don't mind a hammer. On a morning bright as brass, Jake laid a square of wood on the table. He'd planned it smooth as a prayer and carved a small thing into the edge, a laughing line of script, the words his life had learned the hard way. Yeah, she traced the letters with a flour-dusted finger and smiled until she had to turn away and stir the stew before it went too thick. Men filed in, doffed hats, reached for plates. Work waited out past the yard. Weather kept its secrets and then threw them at the world when it got bored. Life did what life does, and still, when the coffee poured and the bread cracked, when laughter found the rafters and sat there like a robin stubborn for spring, the kitchen kept its promise. It filled men up. It kept them standing. As for the porch, where he'd asked and she'd answered, well, every evening, if the light was right and the wind had the sense to be still, two shadows met there and stayed a while. Not to count ledgers, not to play on fences, just to watch the sky fold itself down neat and say its soft goodbye over a house that had learned how to be a home again.